Good evening, everyone. Appreciate you being here tonight. Go ahead and encourage you to turn to Genesis chapter 18. As I promised last week, we're looking again at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you remember, last week we looked at the perspective or certain characteristics that Abraham demonstrated that I believe that we all need to exemplify in our own lives. And tonight I want to turn our attention to the second, certainly not in preeminence, but the second for our consideration of the characters in the story, and that being the Lord. Now we know in Genesis chapter 18, if you'll follow along with me, in Genesis chapter 18 into chapter 19, something very interesting happens because we see as we open up in Genesis chapter 18 that in verse 1 it says, "And the Lord appeared to him," that is to Abraham, "by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes," Abraham again lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, three men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, of course, he ran. Pay attention to that, three men. Then, of course, as you see this story unfold and the promise again given to Abraham, in particular, we see at this point Sarah laughing that she was going to have a child now at 89 years old, that she was going to have a child. But it is very clear that in chapter 18, through the whole chapter, it is the Lord who is interacting all this time with Abraham. In fact, it says in verse 17, the Lord said, it's the Lord again who's speaking. You get to the end of chapter 18, you look at the very last verse in chapter 18, verse 33, and it reads like this: "And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place." Then, if we remove the chapter divisions, we continue reading. "The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was standing in the gate of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth." So we have the three men in chapter 18 that the Lord entertains. And then as we come into Sodom and Gomorrah, we have two men, but we know that the third was the Lord, and he has returned. So we turn our attention to the Lord. And as we think about the nature of God, as it's demonstrated in particular in these two chapters, there's a whole host of things that we are aware of that come to mind when we think about God and his nature. And I think first and foremost, what maybe comes to, at least it comes to my mind, is that God listens. That God, when we talk to God, when we pray to God, and when we have interactions with God, that God hears us. And it's not like you hear or you listen to your wife. You just simply nod and say, "Yes, can I get back to the ball game?" There's this careful, tentative, passionate listening that God does. He listened to Sarah when he made the promise. And we see that in chapter 18. In fact, if you back up to chapter 17, it's Abraham who laughs at this time in chapter 17 and verse 17. But here in chapter 18, he listens to Sarah as she laughs and saying that you are going to have a promise. If you look in chapter 18, you look at verse 12 and verse 13, we'll read them. "So Sarah laughed," look at it, laughed to herself. And she was outside the tent, saying, "After I am worn out, my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old. Go to that next slide. God listens. Even when if we could make it this way, or maybe massage it into this, God even listens to our secrets. The things that we don't tell anyone else, the things that nobody else knows about us, God knows those things. Sarah laughed to herself. Shall I have a child? God listens. Even in those secret moments, God still hears us. God also heard what was happening in Sodom. You see that? Look at verse 21. God listens to sin. God knows sins. I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. God listens. One of the most dangerous things that every human possesses is found in our mouth. Good or bad, God listens. And we need, to the very best of our capabilities, control that fire, James calls it, that rudder that is able to steer us in whatever direction we choose. God listens, and he heard the sin of Sodom in particular. But I think this story is perhaps most famous for God listening in those moments of desperation, because that's what we see Abraham doing. Desperately pleading with God, trying to convince him, beginning in verse 24 with 50, going all the way down to 10. God, just please don't destroy it. Just please, please. There are those moments in life, aren't there, when you might be like Abraham, begging God, down on your knees, crying out to God, God, please, please. God hears us in those moments of desperation, in those moments when no one else knows, no one else heard. God knows. In those moments when sin is in our life, guess what? God knows. God hears those moments too. And especially in those moments, in those valleys, in those dark, dim times in our life, God hears those. And that's what Abraham is doing here, crying out, desperately pleading with God. But we see throughout this story, we definitely see that God is a being who listens to us, who hears us. God is also the judge. We see that here too, as well. That God is judge, jury, and executioner, I suppose that we could say. But the verse in all this that is the most striking to me is in verse 25, when Abraham, this is what Abraham says: far be it from you to do such a thing, as he's pleading. Far be it to you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall the judge of all the earth do what is just? Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is? God is the judge of all the earth. He is the one that makes the decisions. Now, that perhaps brings to mind a whole lot of different passages or a whole lot of different ideas. Maybe flat out it says in Romans chapter 3 and verse 6, Paul insinuates that God is the one who is going to judge over everything, over everyone. God is the one that we stand before. Maybe it brings to mind this passage in Psalm 96. Real quick, flip over there and read that. It's a beautiful psalm. with the tone of praising God. And as you come to the end of this particular psalm, let the heavens be glad, verse 11, and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it. And you see the joy and the excellence in God's creation. Everything is praising God. Then all the trees of the forest sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes. For he comes. Verse 13 begins. For he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness, in the peoples in his faithfulness. When we think about God judging the world, I don't know about you, but that's a relief. Can you imagine? And I think about this frequently. Can you imagine being the judge? Having to make the decision of where someone spends an eternal destiny? Can you imagine that type of weight and the enormity of that decision? And let alone making the decision for someone who has this lifestyle. Well, they've always been a good person, whatever that means. They've never harmed someone else. And then to have the righteousness to say, depart from me, I never knew you. But we know that God is the judge. And being the judge, he is just. He is just. There is no questioning whether he has made the right decision or not. We see in verse 21 the thoroughness of his judgment, right? He heard the outcry, and at that moment, he could have wiped Sodom and Gomorrah off the face of the planet, and nobody would have blinked an eye. But he said, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come up to me. And if not, look at it, I will know. I will know. God knows. If you underline anything in your Bible, underline the fact that God knows what is in man. God is the judge, and he judges with justice and equity, and certainly impartiality. I think that is perhaps fulfilled in its fullest sense in Acts chapter 10. The impartiality of God. In Acts chapter 10, you remember Peter has this vision of these unclean animals in this blanket, and he has, I will rise, kill, and eat. I will never do that, Lord. And of course, it leads him to Cornelius as the story unfolds. But there's an interesting thing in verse 34 of Acts chapter 10 when Peter says, truly, I know. Truly, now I understand that God is not a respecter of persons. You remember that? Now I understand. Now I get it. I know that God is impartial. It brings me a lot of comfort in life. That God isn't partial and he's not swayed one way and he can't be bought. And he's completely just. And you see it permeating this passage the justice, the impartiality of the judge of all the earth. There's one more thing, one more characteristic that here is indicative of who God is, and that's his patience. I cannot tell you how thankful I am that I serve a patient God, a God who bears with me in my foolish mistakes, and a God who is a God of second chances, and third and fourth and fifth. But God is so patient. And you see it. He's patient with Abraham. I mean, we start in verse 24, and you see the patience that he has with Abraham just to listen. I'm telling you, when my kids start down that rant of, well, can I, and I just stop, or I'm going to say no. But the patience of God to listen and to say, yeah, I'll spare it for 50, for 45, for 40, for 30, for 20, for 10, I'll spare it. The patience of God to listen to Abraham and to agree. Then you get into chapter 19 and you see how God is so patient with Lot. In chapter 19, here is Lot, and he's hosting these angels who are there with him. And the angels, they say, up, get away from this place. We're about to destroy it, just as God has sent us to do. But look at this in verse 16 of chapter 19. This small little statement about Lot. It says, but he lingered. He lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his two daughters by the hand. Look at it. Here's the description. The Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. How often, all right, how often do you linger over this world? How often do we give a second thought to the fill in the blank, this possession, this thing that ultimately is going to pull us away from God? But how often do we linger over that? Or how often do we get distracted with the things in this world, not the possessions, but the events of this world? And we linger and we let our mind stay fixated on those things, and it distracts us from God. Aren't you thankful that God is patient? And that in those moments that we linger, when we give it a second look, and when we spend just a split second more than we want to, that God is patient towards us and he's merciful. But I think his patience, at least in my opinion, is ultimately displayed in the fact that he didn't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah right from the get go. That we see the outcry in verse 21 that has come up to God, that God knows about it in verse 21, and that he went down to see if the thing was so, to see if it was really as bad as he had heard. When all along, don't you think he already knew? Then you connect verse 21 of chapter 18 with chapter 19's verse 13. 19:13 reads like this. For we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord. So the Lord has sent us to destroy it. The outcry again mentioned God is patient, even patient for Sodom and Gomorrah, one of the most wicked places that has ever existed on the face of the planet. In fact, it is so wicked that we see it described in chapter 19 as Lot. And we'll look at it next week. We'll look at Lot and his place here in this story. And there's a lot of good things about Lot. But it is so bad that the men, every single man, verse 4, came out against the house. It was so bad that Lot didn't trust the people and invited them to come to his house. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, surrounded the house. And they beat against the house, begging. What a wicked, wicked place. But yet, God is patient. Our God, He listens to you. Right? He hears what you're saying. He's patient towards you. But ultimately, listen to me, He's the judge of all the earth. And one day we will stand before Him and give an account for everything that we've done. Whether it's good or bad, we will stand before the Lord. If you're not ready to do that tonight, let me encourage you to do that. Get right with Him as together we stand and sing.